Hi, I'm Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Ben Kinsley is joining us this evening. I've not mentioned this before, but I should. Ben is a sponsor of our show, which we thank you very much.
Of course.
And he's the founder of Imperium Advisors, and you specialize in innovative public policy solutions, grassroots advocacy, strategic communication management, and critical government information management. And he finds time to be a co-host and co-producer of Vote for Vermont.
Well, thank you, Pat.
Wow, Ben. What do you do when you're not here? We know now.
Yeah, exactly. Everything on that list and more.
I know
Yeah.
that. And a lobbyist.
Yes.
We're lobbyists. Oh, anyway, but our guests this evening are Steve Ness, who's a PhD and Family Support Program Manager for Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. Correct?
Thank you.
And I've mentioned this many times before, but I am on the board of directors of Prevent Child Abuse Vermont, and also just made vice president. Did you know that?
Congratulations. Yes, I did.
Yes, and then this is Allison Cerrone, who is a kinship care provider. And tonight we're talking about the scope of what a kinship care provider is, caregivers. I think all of us have read in the paper about grandparents kind of taking over with the children, grandchildren, I guess, the children of their children, I was going to say, that's articulate, but grandchildren. And I've learned tonight that it's not just grandparents, it's a whole laundry list of folks who come in and take on that kinship role. So I'm very interested to talk about this because it's a phenomenon happening in Vermont and we need to know about it and recognize it. So our guests today, I've invited them, so Ben, maybe you could kick us off.
Sure. So we ask all of our guests to tell them a little bit about themselves, to kind of introduce the audience to, who you are and what you do and how you are arrived here in Vermont if you are from elsewhere. So Allison, would you like to start us off? Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Right at the moment, I am actually caring for 2 young children that I adopted about a year ago, and in the process of applying for school. I just got my BA, and I'm looking to get my master's in psychology. That's about it. I've always lived in Vermont. We live in Cabot, Vermont right now, and I can't think of that much else to say.
Well, you'll explain to us as we go on what the kinship care role is, because it's so important. And Steve?
Well, I'm a psychologist by background, and I worked in community mental health for about 10, 11 years.
Bless you.
Yeah, saw all kinds of families and saw firsthand all kinds of folks with traumatic experiences. I also worked in the court system. That happened to be in Connecticut for several years, where I did custody and visitation evaluations and mediated family disputes. And also consulted a little bit on domestic violence issues. And then ended up finding Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. And the thrust of my thinking about my work had gone more and more toward prevention, and so Prevent Child Abuse Vermont was a fantastic place to put it into practice. So I've been with PCAVT now for 11 years, and I'm the Family Support Programs Manager, so I oversee the parenting programs and our parent helpline and things like that.
That's great.
Very cool.
And we're going to talk about that, but since you've mentioned Prevent Child Abuse, could you talk a little bit about the organization, not specifically to your role, but the organization and the scope of what they present?
Sure. Prevent Child Abuse Vermont has been in existence now for 43 years. It began as from a Parents Anonymous group right here in Montpelier and grew from there. And currently we focus on 3 program areas. One of them are the parenting programs. So the family support area is one. Secondly, we do a great deal of work in the child sexual abuse prevention arena. There we work with child care agencies and personnel and schools a lot. And those programs are very innovative. They do include Care for Kids for preschool through second grade, and then a program called We Care Elementary, which we wrote for third through sixth grade, and then finally a program called Sexual Abuse Free Environment for Teens, or SAFE-T program, for middle schoolers, 7th and 8th grade. Fantastic programs and deserving of a lot of attention in and of themselves. But at any rate, then the third area that we are focused on, it began with shaken baby syndrome prevention, abusive head trauma prevention efforts, and expanded then with the toddler deaths that we witnessed in this state a few short years ago. We expanded into nurturing toddler care, added components of, for example, safe sleep. So those are the three program areas that we are currently focused on at PCABT. And we do some special events and other things too, like our walks for children. There'll be a walk in Montpelier in middle of August. August 18th, I believe, is the date.
Very nice.
And I've gone to a couple PCAVT events, and they're really well done, really great, passionate testimonies from people. Some of the best. And I go to a lot of events, like fundraising events and community organizing events, and the PCAVT events are some of the best ones that I've been to. It's really very professional, very moving, great presentations, great, table set up for those types of events. It's really
A lot of
good.
thinking goes, there's a lot of preparation that goes into every one of those conferences.
And great sponsors
Great
too. Like,
sponsors.
it's amazing the different types of sponsors that you have. Everything from, I think the fundraising dinner this spring, and there was like everything from craft beer and spirit makers to ski areas to manufacturers across the gambit. All over.
Yeah.
All over Vermont.
That's one of the things that's wonderful about the work is that it's nonpartisan. Anybody who cares about children and families can have a role to play in helping out.
Yeah, and I think that we've always talked about, when we say Prevent Child Abuse Vermont, you obviously think of children, but as Steve was really pointing out, it's parents, families, teachers, the community. There's a lot of work that Prevent Child Abuse does with individuals, with groups, because it's not just the child, it's their environment, the people they come in contact with, and everybody needs to be educated. I wish you would hope you remember this name. It was a 3 and 4 year old program about touching, and do you remember the name of that?
It may have been Care for Kids.
Care for Kids,
yes.
that was it. I sat through that. One of the people at the office did it for us. It was so perfect. How do you talk to a 3 and 4 year old about what's good touch, what's bad touch? This thing was just right on, as Linda always says, age appropriate and trauma informed, because everything they do is geared towards that age group, and that there's no, really a bad reaction from any of the words or anything that's said or done. It's really done well.
Is a very interesting program. It does emphasize adult responsibility.
Right.
That is, the adults have to look out for and protect the children.
Right.
Children can learn some things to help themselves out too, but they can't be expected to totally protect themselves from these kinds of things. And there's a great deal of emphasis on healthy relationships and on empathy.
Right.
Which is a key ingredient, really, in all of our programs.
That's great.
Well, and I think it's important when we talk about all the touch points that you have with different stakeholder groups, because nothing happens in a vacuum, right? There's someone knows something or should notice something at some point in anything that happens with these kids, and so being involved in all those stakeholder groups is really important. Especially, you mentioned teachers and caregivers, like daycare providers and stuff. They spend more time with kids than anyone outside the parents, really.
That's true.
So that's a big touch point.
That's right.
So who, and that kind of leads into, who participates in these programs? Like, what are the stakeholder groups? Who is participating in the programming that you guys are putting on outside of the kids and maybe the parents?
Well, there are all kinds of participants. In our parenting programs, of course, there are many parents, but other care providers too, who participate in the programs. And the structure of our parenting programs generally involves having an adult group, and that may be parents or step-parents or just any adult who's in a taking care,
Right.
providing role. Often there's a children's instructional group, okay, where they're being exposed to and learning some of the same things that the adults are, but in a more in an age-appropriate way,
right.
Often in a more fun way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to be with them.
Yeah, right. And of course, we do provide childcare at all of our
Right.
programs when that is required. And also, I'll point out that many of our programs do take place at dinner time because that's when we can get the most families together.
Right.
So we provide a meal at the programs too. Now, in order to do that, we must work with, and we want to work with, all kinds of collaborating partners. Because for one thing, we're a statewide private nonprofit. We do not have facilities all over the state. So we are looking for places to host the program. And that means talking with interested collaborators. Also, we train many volunteers to help out with the
You
program.
have a lot of volunteers.
A lot,
right?
yes. Yes,
Is 50 the number I remember?
for the family support programs, it's usually more like about 175 in the
Right,
course of a year.
Wow.
Because we provide two types of parenting programs. One, structured, curriculum-based, parenting education
Right.
classes, and our programs are of some length. That is, 13 weeks long, 15
Oh, wow.
weeks long, and so on. So we use curricula, and we also provide support groups. Okay, so we don't have a curriculum for that. A little more open-ended.
Listening to people.
Yes, very important too. So care providers can come and talk about the challenges and difficulties. Also, share some of the successes that they've had too.
Right.
So these programs, we do a combination of the structured and the support groups. We do about 60 parenting programs per year around the state, different locations. So we work with collaborating agencies and people.
Do the courts send people to you?
Yes,
in
they
your
do.
area? I know there are other programs where they definitely send people that appear before them. The judges send them.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
The Department for Children and Families, DCF, refers people for parenting classes quite often, sometimes for
Right.
support groups. And family court does too.
Yeah.
It is interesting. We are, even though we're a small state, we're a big state. And there's a different character to each region of the state.
Right.
So some places around the state, we get a lot of DCF and family court referrals. Other places, not as many. But people come to us in a variety of different ways. Often there has been some difficulty or challenge in the family, and that's why people come.
Right.
And that may have to do with substance abuse, for one thing. Sometimes there are mental health issues. Domestic violence is pretty common. Also, people are often just under a lot of stress, including financial stress. Parents stressed out by money issues are often in a very difficult state. And so they come for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes professionals who are working with them, maybe a therapist or a substance abuse counselor, will refer them. But many people in other human service agencies just know about us.
Right.
And will just say, like,
Right.
gee, you ought to check out those people. They have some parenting programs. And we have a parents helpline, a 1-800 number, 1-800-CHILDREN, you can call. And so people call and enter into our groups that way too. So they come all kinds of ways.
April was Child Abuse Prevention Month, and the governor signed a proclamation. And we were at a very large event over at the State House in the Cedar Creek Room. That was very nice.
Yeah, lovely.
was good.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yes, nice to see all the people who came.
Yeah.
And it's always a privilege to be able to serve Ben and Jerry's ice cream in the
Oh, yes.
cafeteria.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. For sure.
Jerry is very much a supporter of Prevent Child Abuse
Yes, he is.
Vermont, and very, very close to Linda Johnson, the executive director, so we thank them very much. So Allison, sitting here so quiet, we're having to get you into this. How did you and Steve first connect?
We connected at a group in Burlington that is Kinship advocacy group,
Ah,
and I'm trying to think of all of the people who are there. Cove
yeah. Oh, Cove, yes, for
Cove.
sure. Yeah.
and Easter Seals, Prevent Child Abuse Support, and I don't want to forget anybody who was important who was there.
Yeah, there
But it's
are
a great group of people.
all kinds of people. This is a forming coalition. It's new, and so like Vermont Kin as parents. Brenda Hamlin from Vermont Kin
Oh,
comes.
nice.
And there are people who have a lot of experience
Yeah, because
with
they're all, Cove
foster,
is
adoptive,
is elderly, is that the right
Community
word?
of Vermont
My
Elders.
age people.
Ruby Baker's their executive
Right.
director.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She-
Cove is a great organization.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed with them.
but other folks who have done all kinds of things, from kinship to foster and adoptive parenting. Linda Del Duca, Jim Hallway comes, and it's quite an interesting collection of people. A couple of people from the state too, and Lund. So it's a.
And we've had many of those people on the show.
You
over
may
the
have.
years.
Yes, I think we have. Yes.
The one thing that, I was speaking of the Lund, and Linda says this all the time, Linda Johnson, that the numbers of child abuse have gone down over the years, but the numbers of children that are neglected have gone up primarily because of the opioid crisis, where mom and dad are who knows where, and kind of forget they've got children. And it's not abuse, physical abuse, but it's just, no dinner, no clean clothes, whatever happens when you're somewhere else on smoking. So it's
Yeah.
really a problem.
Yes, it's recently been recognized that there are many children who are neglected
Right.
physically and or emotionally,
Yeah.
and they suffer greatly.
I bet.
The effects are devastating over
You
years.
can't fool kids, they know what's going on.
Oh yeah.
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 And we have made inroads on, for example, child sexual abuse. Compared to where we were at 20, 25 years ago, the rates are reduced greatly, like
Right.
about 60%.
Wow.
But there are still
Right.
too many incidents that go
Right.
on and too many faulty relationships. Physical abuse too, we've made some inroads. But yeah, neglect deserves more attention.
Yes.
And that is the rising piece of the equation.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about the role of kinship parents.
Maybe we could ask Allison.
Yeah.
She's living.
Exactly. And what does that look like?
There's a lot of diversity in kinship parents. I have been going to a support group on Tuesday nights that was run through the Family Center, and the stories are incredibly diverse. It is. I happen to be an ex-stepmother who adopted my ex-step-grandchildren, but there are grandparents and cousins, there are siblings, someone who knows the child, who takes on the role of caregiving for that child, and it is extremely complex. There are complex relationships to negotiate when those family dynamics shift and change. And so the role can vary. I think that, in my particular case, I chose to adopt my two youngest sons. Some people are choosing to not go through the court system, to do informal childcare.
Right.
And so there are many different structures.
Kind of like a de facto
Right.
adoption, even though they don't have legal custody.
Right. And some have legal custody but choose not to
You
adopt.
used the word, I hope I wrote it in what I heard, fictive?
Fictive
What is fictive? Fictive caregiving.
Well, kinship, I think that kinship is generally defined as a biological connection.
Okay.
Right.
So
Well, it's kin, K-I-N, right? That's
Kin.
kin.
Right.
And so fictive kin may define relationships outside of the biological connection.
Can you
So
spell
for
that
instance,
word for me? It's just
I
not
wish, I
registered.
really
Oh,
wish I could. I wish I could.
Fictive,
Can you
F-I-C-T-I-V-E, fictive.
Oh, fictive.
So, whereas kinship care is often thought of as care by not the parent, but any other biological relative, most often grandparents, but not
Right.
exclusively. It may be an uncle, aunt, or uncles and aunts, cousins, any number of relatives. It is also the case that there are friends of the family.
Right.
And
Right.
some people are called Uncle so-and-so,
Right.
even though actually they're not a blood relative.
Right.
Right.
But they're a friend of the family. And then there are many different family constructs and structures. So there are blended families, step families, and so there are many kinds of relationships. Fictive kin involves having one of the non-biological relative
Right.
involved in taking care of children.
Right. And we're sitting here talking about support for the parent, for the adult. What happens for the kids? Because I'm thinking, I didn't have any question on this, but I'm thinking, here are the kids, whatever happened to mom and dad, if they're not around anymore, if something, whatever, happened to them, and now they're in a whole different environment with somebody who's learning how to take care of kids, and the two
Right.
that you have, that's a whole, who are they, what do they like, and the kids are in a whole new environment. What's there for the kids? Do the kids get any support, or could they if they needed it, through DCF, or?
That's a really good
Yeah, 'cause
question.
I'm thinking they
It's
must be
be-
really confused.
Oh, it's very confusing, and you know, I think that there is an incredible sense of loss and confusion
Sure.
for children.
Yeah.
You know, I think when children come through DCF custody and then come into kinship care,
Right.
that there are resources that are more readily available. It isn't that they're not necessarily available to other kinship care providers. It's that being involved in those systems allows us to
Right.
access the information.
Right.
So Easter Seals, for instance, for myself has been an incredible support system.
Oh, really?
But also, where I live in Cabot, and I think that other parents may find this too, school system can be an incredible support,
Yeah,
community,
right.
and I think really reaching out and looking for those
I
support
think the
systems.
teachers are so much more aware of children's issues than they certainly were in my
Right.
day. I don't remember, you just sat and learned, and that was the end of that story. And if you had a problem, take it out.
Learning is so much more interactive.
Yes, exactly.
It is,
n-
yeah.
Nowadays, and I think that's part of why teachers are more and more starting to recognize issues at home because they're seeing changes in behavior with the students that they're working with. And this is an issue that we even talked about last week with the Lieutenant Governor about how do we more closely align child services with school systems because they have that level of access.
Right. Well, there's a real push, I think, I've heard it all over the state house, is to put an actual caseworker in each school, so that they would make that link to any services that your children would need or that you would need, and make it happen, instead of the poor, the law enforcement officer who's there, who, they're all taking on
Right.
the role of DCF.
Right.
And when they're making calls or trying to solve an issue, there's so many personal things that are intertwined that they gotta deal with.
It's one of those agencies that really needs to be in every community
Yeah.
around the state. We have a school system that is in every community around the state and in many places has excess capacity, whether that means, usually that means excess physical capacity in their buildings. So why not use some of that excess physical capacity on the location and bring in some of those
Well, and you said something
DCF
interesting
staff?
before, every area in this state is different. So
Absolutely.
how a DCF person might operate in Montpelier or Burlington is much different than Woodstock or Winooski or whatever. It's
Yeah.
all different, and the
Well, and
problems are
it
different.
also changes the conversation because, if a teacher notices an issue that they think may be a manifestation of something going on at home, they can say, come with me, we're going to walk up the hall, as opposed to, here, call this person.
Right, yeah,
You
you
know.
can take care.
It's very challenging in schools, very challenging for teachers. We have heard from, for example, the Vermont Principals Association, that the teachers are facing a crisis,
Right.
really, in that half the kids who come in
Yeah.
seem to have traumatic experiences.
For sure.
And it can affect their learning and their behavior. And so it's very challenging for teachers who already have their hands full.
Yeah,
But these, for my taste, what I'd like to see are many more prevention efforts, more resources in prevention, because while there can be very good treatments, you know that it takes much more in terms of time and money, resources, to deal with the after effects of traumatic events. As much as possible, if we can prevent them, we're
For sure.
way ahead of the
Well,
game.
that's
We
a big
want to
thing now
strengthen
in health
families.
and everything, right?
Absolutely.
Prevention's
Yeah.
a big thing in healthcare.
Yeah.
If you can
Yeah.
prevent getting something, eating well, living a good life.
Well, and in the health field, I think it's increasingly recognized that early adverse childhood experiences have long-lasting and serious effects on health. In fact, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study from about 20 years ago now, a landmark study, and a number of studies since then, have shown that most people have some adverse childhood experiences or traumatic experiences. Most people have at least one, but on a 0 to 10 scale, the more you have, if you have 3, 4 traumatic experiences, the kinds of things like we're talking about, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, but also there are other household dysfunctions, you might call them, or difficulties. There may be somebody in the home with a substance abuse problem, or there may be domestic violence, or maybe a member of the household went to prison. Separation, divorce in and of itself, too. Mental illness in the family. These are all very challenging experiences.
They're all real.
Yeah.
That's right. And when you start to have multiple adverse childhood experiences, it's very clear from the research that it affects people for the rest of their lives, really, in terms of both physical health, and I'm including heart disease, cancer, and so on, diabetes, asthma, but also mental and emotional well-being, anxiety, depression, and so on. Suicidal feelings are highly correlated with adverse childhood experiences.
Allison,
And
when you
mental
were
health.
really wanting to take these children into your home, did you have to go through meetings and stuff so that they would know who you are and what the setting is going to be, that like they do with an adoption?
Well, because I'm Victive Kin, I knew them.
Yeah.
And so what we chose to do, because they were already in a foster care system, is to do a really conscientious transition. And we did the transition slowly. They might be with me for a day, and then the next week they may be with me for a couple of days, just to try to make that transition as smooth as possible. And I think that helped a lot.
Was there somebody from DCF sort of overseeing the transition, that things were going well? Did they check on they probably have so much to do. I don't know how they do all this stuff.
Frankly, I feel badly for DCF. I feel that they have a lot on their plate, and it's difficult. It's difficult for them.
Yeah. And God forbid one thing goes wrong and it just
Yeah.
blows up when they've been
Yeah.
trying so hard.
It is very interesting. The kinship care can involve a formal arrangement or an informal arrangement.
Right.
And in fact, I think there's much more on the end of informal arrangements than we might realize in our state.
Because a lot of those may not be documented.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I know of a couple of them.
Yeah.
Just
Do
off,
you?
just out of the relationships that I have
Absolutely.
with folks, that I know of a couple of them.
Yes. Yes. I actually realized along the way that my wife and I have provided an informal arrangement
Safe house for someone.
long ago. Well, actually, for 3 teenage boys, not at the same time,
Bless
but
you.
in a period of
Is there an
short
award?
years. And we didn't know enough to call it. We didn't call it anything. We
right.
just did it, and I think that happens a lot
Right.
around the state.
Yeah.
It's very hard to find good data and information on kinship
Well,
care.
especially
Like how
if
many?
it's not being reported.
Well, right.
It's taking care of it in the family.
Yeah. There were some estimates a few years ago, with the 2010 census. Nationally, it was about 4%. And in the state of Vermont, it was just over 4% children were in some form of kinship care. Then, in more recent years, about 2015, it looked like it had gone up over like 6%, but the numbers are, I'm not sure how good they are, because the
that
data
could have
is
just been
incomplete.
could have been a reporting change, not necessarily a change in the actual numbers.
Yeah, and in terms of, and much of this data was able to be captured around grandparents, because they're the most common relative to.
Well, that's actually why I thought it was just originally, it was just grandparents, because that's what you read in the papers about
Right.
kinship being grandparents, that those of us at this age taking on little children,
Yeah.
hello.
Yeah, but
Well,
it's certainly others,
you
and,
do
and,
it.
and then the informal arrangements where they're actually not blood relatives,
Yeah.
maybe just as common. Some people think
Yeah.
more common, but we haven't captured that data. We don't
Well, and I can
really know
think
exactly
just
how many.
in my family, like growing up, it wasn't blood relatives. Like we had family friends that we knew that if anything happened, it was the family friends that we would
That you'd go to.
Yeah.
that we go to.
Yeah,
And
and that-
sometimes they're closer than family.
Yeah,
just because
exactly.
the bloodlines
Like we
are
grew
so-
up
That's
with
right.
them.
The
You-
relationship's
the
not there.
child has a significant tie or bond with some of these people, and they may have relatives, but what if they're in California?
Yeah, exactly.
Or in my case, in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Those community
Tennis.
bonds, those can make a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think for parents and families that are under stress, that those informal arrangements perhaps make a bigger difference than we realize. We often talk about what's the difference between a child who grew up in a very difficult situation
Right.
where they are not okay, and what's the difference between a child who grew up in a very different, a difficult situation who is okay.
Right.
And resiliency is a huge part of
Yeah,
that. And
right.
so having someone who can take some of the stress off, I think can make a tremendous difference
How
for
Absolutely.
long
our
have you had
children.
the children with you? And
2.5 years.
And they were obviously very excited and willing to make that transition, I'm sure, because they would have, yours would be sort of a permanent home for them, not a,
They were 1 and 3
Oh, so
when I
little,
met
little,
them. They're
little,
very young
little.
children.
Right.
So perhaps verbalizing about what they're excited about or expressing is a
Yeah.
little bit different
Oh,
for
okay.
them. But I can say that over the last couple years, we certainly have bonded as a
That's great.
family.
That's right.
They're
forever
terrific.
home. I love that when they talk
Yeah,
about
forever home.
when people are adopting dogs, they're forever home. But because I would think when they go to live with people temporarily, that's a very must be unsettling.
Yeah,
It's very hard for
you know?
children.
Yeah.
I would
And
To
think
get
so.
dropped off
Yeah.
maybe at
'Cause
night
for
at 10
any-
o'clock in a stranger's house, and
Mm-hmm.
that's
Oh,
just very unsettling.
that's got to be jarring.
Yeah, right.
And I think for anybody, change in relationships can be very difficult, and can be a real loss.
Right,
And for these children who go to another home,
right.
it's got to be very, very difficult.
Right.
Ultimately, in the long run, hopefully a really good thing. There are a lot of positives here, but
Right.
there's no doubt that it's very difficult. And their roles change, but they may or may not even realize, if they're really young, they may not understand or even know at first what happened, which is interesting.
Right.
But older kids, they know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's extremely
Those
difficult.
7th and 8th graders definitely know.
Yeah,
Oh, they
sure
know.
And
And
it's right, and it's difficult because you were talking about grateful or excited. I
Right.
mean, I think that understanding the transition that they just went through,
Right.
I actually found that when they could express their anger towards me about the things that had happened in their lives and the feelings that they were having, that was actually the sign that our relationship was
I
getting
see, 'cause they're
stronger and
comfortable.
that we were building trust
Yeah.
and we
Right.
could talk about feelings
Nice.
and some of the insecurities and fears because they came to my home and only time and building that relationship is what's going
great.
to support the idea that they have permanency.
Because I think it's the same thing when do you tell a child they've been adopted? I mean, if it's a very young child, and how do you start to talk about that, and when that's pretty,
And what does that mean?
yeah, and how do you know what to do? When's the right time to say X, Y, Z, and not to get into the specifics, but how do you as a parent know when it's the right time
I can tell you my theory. I don't know if everybody would agree with it,
Well-
is that we always keep an atmosphere of honesty within our home. And so we build on the information. Of course, I told them they were adopted.
Mhm.
And as time
But
goes
a lot of
on,
people choose not to. And I don't know what
Right.
impact, when you find out at 17 you're adopted, what that does.
guess I would have a difficult
Yeah.
time with that. It's just not the way that I operate. I feel that if we keep that atmosphere of honesty, then we can talk about adoption in a really peripheral way when they're young, but they know, so then we know how to have the conversations
Right.
moving
Good for
forward.
you.
Yeah.
Right, and they don't, maybe at 2 or 3, they don't need to know the details of how that
And they don't
happened.
understand it.
Right,
No.
but that sets up the conversation
Right.
for a later time.
Right.
At
Yeah.
2 or 3, what they knew is that we went out and got adoption shoes that were their favorite color, and we got to walk to the state
Oh,
house
that's
and get
cool.
adopted. And it was fun, and it was an adventure.
Yeah.
And so then we build on those things. We still have the adoption shoes, and we still talk about
Oh,
it.
that's so
And
sweet.
so for anniversary, we go out and we get adoption shoes every year.
That's cool.
That's how
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
works.
That's very cool.
But it is important to just answer a child's question in a way that's appropriate for them,
Yes.
and keep it short.
Yeah.
You know, and
That's
see if
the
they have more questions. And then
I
with
got it.
time,
Right.
yeah.
It's like-
I always waited for her to actually ask the question when it was time, then I knew you could have a conversation when she'd ask
Mhm.
questions about growing up or something, she'd
Mhm.
ask, and then I'd answer.
Now it's
it, you
time.
know?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
time.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So there's a great Kinship Caregivers guide on the DCF website. It's really comprehensive, provides a lot of information on legal issues, help with basic needs, and other types of resources. So that's definitely something for our viewers to check out. But we talked a little bit about some of the barriers for the children in the transition piece of it. What other barriers are there for kinship parents and also, I guess, kinship kids? Is that the right term? Or the what barriers are there for those relationships?
I think every situation is very unique. One of the things that I've heard people talking about is, so when we have a relationship and that relationship is defined, say we're a grandparent and we have a grandchild, I don't know if this is, actually maybe this isn't considered a barrier, it's a transition where the relationship changes and now the caregiver is balancing not only the relationship with the child, but the relationship with the parent, which can be very
Oh,
complex.
okay, yeah.
And the parent is also negotiating a different relationship with a child. Everything shifts, and those are pretty dramatic shifts for everyone to be adjusted to be talking about.
Ah.
And that may or may not be a voluntary shift with the
Right.
parents.
So it
and-
can be
Yeah.
very complex.
Yeah.
I think that I've heard kinship parents talking about that, how they really love their children, but it's a very difficult conversation to be having in that moment because there are challenges there, and they really love their grandchildren or the child that they're taking care
Right,
of,
right.
and how do we protect all of those relationships and keep the child safe and secure
Yeah.
to the best of our ability.
I always think whenever I hear conversations about this that a family member is always, if it's a safe environment, a family member is always the best caregiver. But it does bring in a lot of complexities about the relationship with the parents, because
Right.
presumably a family member has a relationship with the parents and the kids have a relationship with the parents, presumably, and all of those dynamics kind of become pretty complicated.
Yeah.
And what if
Yeah.
it goes poorly with the parents? I mean, what does the I'm gonna use grandparent, because what do you do if you have to go get some help with a parent who's angry, who's, the world's done bad things to him or her, and they interfere perhaps with how grandparents are raising their child? I mean, where do you go for help? What happens? DCF again? No wonder they're busy.
Well, and
right.
there are just so many situations.
Yeah.
It depends. In a situation where it's an informal arrangement,
Yeah,
and it may even involve fictive kin,
yeah.
that's very, very difficult
Yes,
because
the legal tie
no-
is with
no-
the
yeah,
parent, not the
the
not the
parent
caregiver.
has not given up their rights or anything like
Yeah.
that, and so that's going to be up to the adults to talk it out.
Right.
They may seek a therapist or some other kinds of help, but that's a tough one.
A very tough, yeah.
Whereas once you get into other systems, meaning, for example, you're involved in court,
Right.
probate court or
Right.
family court. These family situations can end up in probate or family
Right.
court. Then there are other people, including a judge, ultimately, who's involved, and they have some say. And there may be other resources that can be
Right. The
tapped.
guardian ad litem for
I
the
was just
children.
going to say
Right.
that, yeah.
That's a great service, isn't it?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
wonderful.
Yeah. Or if you're talking about a foster or adoptive parent, there are other resources you can call upon. But as to what the answer is, sometimes sometimes parents are in the process
Right.
of trying to grapple with whatever is going on in their life, and they're trying to get
Especially,
it together.
I'm just thinking of family, I know the woman's got the children of her daughter, so now she's dealing with her daughter and has adopted her daughter's children. Her grandchildren are now her children, and that must be
Yeah.
that must be hard to manipulate that and to still have some kind of relationship with your daughter while you're taking care of their kids.
Yeah. Can you imagine being a
Can't.
grandparent and you've enjoyed your grandchildren
And all
and
of a
you've been
sudden-
able to spoil them, and now your role changes?
It's-
Right.
No more
You
holidays.
don't get to be the benevolent grandparent anymore. Yeah.
And not only does their role change, but anybody else in the family has to adjust too.
Sure,
What if there are other children, even adult children?
yeah.
How do they respond? Sometimes they get involved, sometimes they run the other way. And then the
Nothing's ever
children
easy, is it,
themselves.
Steve? What is- Try to do a
Human
good thing, and look what
relationships.
happens.
Yeah. Family units are complex.
Yes,
I
they
think
sure
is what
are.
it comes
This
down
makes
to.
it even more so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to give up on all of the narratives you have on what the perfect family
That's
is,
right.
and be very creative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good point.
And I will point
For you,
out
I'm
too
very
that
impressed.
one of my concerns, and one reason we'd like to find ways to lend more support to kinship families, is that just the grandparents, for example, we started
Yeah,
by
right.
mentioning
Yeah, right,
grandparents.
yeah.
Well, I looked at some of the studies and research of who are these grandparents and are they dealing with any problems and challenges?
Right.
Well, not surprisingly, of course, they are.
Yeah,
Right.
A study a few years ago, the average age was 63 years old, yet many of them were still working.
Yeah, sure,
Okay, so they're working.
yeah.
About 12% of them are in poverty.
Oh,
22% of them had a disability of some sort. All right, 25% of them were single.
Wow.
So you start to think, oh, this is challenging.
This is complicated.
This is challenging for
there
life.
is there any financial support available through the state at all?
Well,
Is there?
my understanding is
Some.
that there is a reach up grant
Oh.
for the child only
Uh-huh.
that can be
Yeah,
applied for.
unless you adopt the child, then it probably doesn't
That's a
apply.
but there can be a reach up grant and modest amounts of
Yeah.
money for the child, and of course, Medicaid, Dr. Dinosaur for
Right.
children, and there may be when you're talking school age, there may be things like school meals and so on. So there's some
Yeah, some,
resources or benefits,
right.
One,
but not a lot.
one of the biggest ones that I hear working families talk about a lot is the child care credits. Those don't transfer, do they? Because they follow the parents.
That would be my
Oh, that's
understanding.
interesting, so
Yeah.
it doesn't
I
go
think
to the
that's
caregiver.
right. I don't. It applies to the parents based on the number of children that they have. I don't think it transfers to grandparents or other.
Well, there's a
Oh,
law
wow.
that should be,
Yeah,
looked
so
at.
that might be one to look
Yeah.
at.
Yeah,
Changed.
that should be examined.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it
Because
make
if
a
you're
big
taking on
difference.
all the responsibility, then
Mhm.
you should get some
Well,
benefit of the
and
parent.
if half of them are working,
Yeah.
that's significant
Right.
because they probably have to find
Right.
you know daycare or
And if
after
they're,
school
if they're in
programs.
poverty, you said 10 or 12 or
12% in the study I looked
So I
at.
wonder if those kids are not there formally, they probably wouldn't count as far as the number in
Mhm.
the family. I wouldn't think, so they wouldn't get funding
Yeah.
for those.
Well,
for those
even
kids.
something as simple as like the what is it? The tax credits, the family tax
Oh,
credits
right. Yeah,
at
right.
the federal level wouldn't
Yeah.
apply.
Wow. There's a
'Cause they
lot
wouldn't count.
that could be done better here, isn't there?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think what Allison was saying a little earlier is one of the most important things is how to lend greater support to these families
Right.
and to reinforce and help with
Right.
resilience. Because this is a difficult role.
Do you,
I
you
mean,
said you do belong to a group, do you, that you can
I
say, this
do.
is what's happening and how did you handle it, kind of a group?
And I do. I started a few weeks ago, and I find it to be very important. Just even that anecdotal, like the
Yeah,
stories.
we're not
like,
alone, right?
oh, this is how I dealt with this, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh well, maybe I will try that.
Right. Good.
And resources. You know, I think that obviously financial resources would be very handy, and to be able to put those together for
Right.
kinship caregivers would be very helpful. Peer support is also really important
Right.
because caregiver resiliency is very important. Children need us to be at our best. Because, I mean, I know on a personal level, and I believe this for other parents, is when we feel balanced and when we have the ability to get respite, to talk to friends, to be part of community, it's much easier to
No.
parent. And the parents who, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't mean to stop you. Steve used the word respite in something he had given to me. What does that mean in this context, respite? Because I saw that word and respite means something else to me. What does that mean in this world?
Well,
Just place
the ability to go out to dinner with a
Oh,
friend
ah.
and have a
Yes.
moment.
Oh, okay, I went right to
A
the
break.
respite house.
No,
What
no, no.
yeah, any kind of break,
Yeah,
any
break,
kind
okay,
of
I guess.
time for yourself, or to
yeah.
do anything.
Personal time. Yeah.
Because I think the other factor is not only are kinship providers often but not always older, the children who are coming into their care often have complex histories.
Yeah, right.
And so not only respite and support, but training. Training. Children who have complex histories have different needs.
Sure.
and
And everybody's different. I think you said that before. Every
Right.
situation is completely different, so it's not a cookie cutter deal,
Mhm.
right? Wow.
We, we offer a number of parenting programs. Certainly, support groups are,
Right.
are one way in which people often feel like they can gain that resilience. Some people really want to learn more. Some people know a lot about child development and so on, but there are folks who want structured learning opportunities. And that can be provided too. We offer a number of parenting groups where there's certain skills development and so on, and we're emphasizing certain things. But even then, it's challenging, extra challenging.
It
Let
is.
me just say that, for example, we work on helping parents have appropriate expectations of their children. Because if you're thinking they should be able to do something that they're just not ready for, whether it's toilet training or anything, and
Right.
there's a tension and a struggle there. Or if you're undershooting, you're not encouraging your child to develop as maximally, optimally, and so on. So that's a tricky thing for any parent. But then you think about, okay, now all of a sudden the family situation's changed. There's another child or two, and they're not the same as the child that you may have raised
Right.
some years ago.
Yeah.
And maybe you're not the same either. But certainly those children are not the same. And so you may have thought of yourself as being a patient person and all that. But then when you try to do the same things with the new children, and they may have complex trauma.
Right.
They may not, and when that happens, toxic stress affects the brain and so on, and it's harder to develop those higher level functions in the brain, the executive functions, the planning and anticipation, all that kind of thing. That's hard. You may be expecting your child to get it right away.
Right.
Well, that
Right. They
may
come from
not
a
be
whole different
realistic.
background.
And I think what you find is that you have to actually really think about, what do we mean by appropriate expectations now? You have to
Right.
adjust
I'm
your
sitting here
thinking.
listening to, if I had two children of my own biological kids, and then we introduce and bring into our home two other children who have completely different backgrounds.
Yes.
I mean, how do even the children mesh, and you're doing expectations, and it's like night and day. This group's had this experience, and your kids have had the experiences you've given them. Whoa.
I think a lot of ways kids, depending on the age group, but kids can be more flexible than adults in ways like that. I think they almost bond quicker
understanding, maybe.
and more understanding, and may just assimilate quicker than adults would in a lot of situations.
Yeah, it's important for adults in a caretaker role to be aware of that in themselves and
Yeah.
not be too rigid about things, and be able to adjust.
Or personalize.
Or
And
personalize.
it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it's my
Because-
fault
because
that
it's
I'm doing
really
something.
Well,
person.
and that happens a little bit anyway. I'm
Right.
a family of 4 kids. I'm the oldest,
Right.
and I think every one of us had a different experience.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
that's just
mom and dad got older.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the other thing too, that as a challenge, particularly probably more so for grandparents or older caretakers, is generational differences. Right.
Yes.
We talked a little bit before the show about digital natives, right?
Yes.
And the challenges that produces, because now there's TVs and cell phones and tablets and all of this digital information that kids are interacting with at a young age now. And an older caretaker may not understand all of the ways that a child may be interacting with these digital interfaces.
It's especially important if you have a child with developmental trauma, because sometimes a lot of digital information coming at a child with developmental trauma, it can overstimulate them, and it can have effects that we may not expect. Sometimes it can actually be helpful for short periods of time to help them calm down, because they're looking at a screen that's not challenging them, and it can help them relax. But I think that it's really important as a caregiver, and as an older caregiver who may not get it, to understand that that does and can have an effect on the developing brain, especially if someone has developmental trauma or is on the spectrum or has a number of co-occurring circumstances happening at the same time.
Yeah.
That it's actually important to think about that.
Wow.
I just watched a movie recently called Serenity that kind of explored that concept of a child who was in a household with domestic abuse, directed at both him and his mother. And he created a computer game because he could control the inputs and the outputs. It was the only thing in his life that he could control.
Right.
And he created a computer game that he could control everything, because that was the only thing that he had control over.
And that was his escape.
And that was his escape.
Yeah.
And his family didn't quite understand that, and that was part of the evolution of the movie, the plot of the movie. But I thought it was very fascinating to see that he couldn't control his home environment, so he created an environment that he could control.
Interesting.
Many older folks and grandparents would say they're not that familiar with it, computers and gaming and all that stuff. So
It's a different world.
It really is a different world. I'll tell you one very interesting idea, a concept is grand family housing. Ever heard of that?
Interesting.
Well, over in Europe, don't they have
Yeah.
homes for that they mix and match, sort of, so the
Yeah,
grandparents
well,
are
I saw this article in the
Yeah.
Washington Post about grand family housing. And you think about, we're referring to grandparents. It doesn't need to be only grandparents, but older, they're digital immigrants, not digital natives. The computer stuff is just not
Yeah.
that comfortable or familiar to them. but also often, they may have health problems. Maybe they don't even have transportation. And often the money is tight and so on. And there are other issues. For example, I believe, subsidized housing. I don't think you can be bringing in other children.
Right. Right.
Things have to be, family friendly or grand family friendly. So they've explored having a housing complex for these kinds of families, kinship families and so on. With the advantages like you can have a community room, you can have a computer room. The grandparents can be learning too. And you can have other people, staff, mental health, computers, whatever you need, come on in. Transportation issues are much reduced because there you all are. So there's some ideas that I think are really interesting to explore for the future.
I think, well, obviously the definition of family is changing, and this is
Absolutely.
one
more example of that.
definition. Steve, we have about a minute and almost 2 minutes left, and I wanted to switch dramatically
All right.
I was volunteering some time over at Prevent Child Abuse Vermont, and I went to look for some soda water, and I opened the refrigerator, and I found stock full of food. There was trays and trays
Why
of food.
all this
and I
food,
said,
and where'd it
"Why
come
is
from?"
this something I don't know as a board member.
Well, that's
So-
very interesting, yeah. As a part of our parenting programs, we often serve food. Years ago, we fell into the easy habit of like ordering pizzas and subs and all that. Okay. Number one, costs a lot of money, actually, when you add it all up. Not the healthiest necessarily, and also not the style of eating we want to promote. We want to promote family style eating. So we made a change. We talked to the Vermont Food Bank. We are not a food shelf, but they did make us special network partners, given what we do. Okay, so we can acquire food ingredients from the food bank for free or very low cost. We have a system of food volunteers and so on, and we produce, we'll do things like produce main courses and dishes and freeze them quickly so that we can get them to different places around the state where we have facilities to keep them frozen and then provide them at programs when we need them.
That's great.
So food is very important. Family mealtime, very important.
Getting anybody to sit down together at a meal these days is a challenge.
Yes,
Everybody's doing something, watching TV, running in and out, and I like the family meal.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Every study in the world says that's the most important bonding time for the family.
Well, it is.
Mealtime.
Yes.
We had a rule in our house, you better show up on Sunday.
Yes.
Sunday was it, so after church, we had the whole afternoon of meals, so anyway. So we are out of time, and I want to thank you both very much. I admire you so much. Bless you for what you're doing, seriously. And you too,
Thank you.
there, Dr. Ness.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm sure you found this very interesting as I did. And we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.